Thank you all very much for coming. It's quite remarkable to see such a sea of faces in a place that I've never been. It's actually been quite overwhelming for me. I didn't really realize that till this morning, to be here, because this is actually the first time that I've been in a country that was behind the Iron Curtain. And that had more of an effect on me than I really realized. I studied totalitarianism for a very long time. It's been 4 decades, and it's one thing to consider it in the abstract, no matter how deeply and for how long. But it's another thing to come somewhere where it's so close and tangible, and where the effects are still evident. I was walked through 2 of your main city squares yesterday, including the square that was set up under Tito with the huge sentinel-like buildings overlooking the cold cement expanse with the brutal metallic sculpture off to the one side, with shadowy and faceless individuals embedded in the metal like an iron dagger thrust into the ground. And it's not for nothing they called that style of architectural brutalism. It was the perfect aesthetic for a very terrible ideology. So, let me tell you what I've been thinking about for all these years, in as brief a period of time as I possibly can manage, and we'll see how much that has utility for everybody in the hall. When I started to study totalitarianism, both on the left and on the right, I was first interested in it, mostly interested in what had happened in Nazi Germany, I guess, and in places like Auschwitz. And even when I was a young person, I was curious about, I would say, the psychological element to that, which was how it was that it was possible, not so much for a social system to go so badly sideways, but for people to go so low, to fall so deep into whatever they fell into, that they were willing to do atrocious things in the service of their group ideology. And I studied that for quite a long time from a political and economic perspective, because when I was a student, and I would say even now, the fundamental hypothesis that's used to explain such things is generally put forth on the sociological level of analysis. But that never struck me as particularly compelling, because I was interested more in what it would be like to be there as a person, as an individual, and how it was that people could bring themselves to turn a blind eye or to participate in the terrible things that happened in so many places over the course of the 20th century. And so that led me deep into an analysis of the understructure of what orients us in the world, I guess. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. I think once you understand a certain set of fundamental realities about the nature of human existence, then a number of pathways forward start to emerge out of the mist, and those pathways lead to very different endpoints. I looked for a long time for something that I couldn't doubt, and I found some of that as a consequence of reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which was the book that I would say, at least in principle, demolished the intellectual and moral credibility of Marxism, although perhaps not for as long as we might have hoped. He thought that the Nuremberg trials were the most important event of the 20th century. And it wasn't like Solzhenitsyn was naive. I mean, he knew perfectly well that there was some element in a post-war trial of the victors having their victory over the vanquished. But he believed, given that he wasn't cynical to the core, that something else was being established at the same time. And what was being established was the fact that there were some acts that were so heinous and so atrocious that they weren't excusable under any moral frame of reference whatsoever. And those are the acts that have come to be defined, let's say, as crimes against humanity. And there was an appeal there to a universal human ethic that transcended the specifics of culture. And it was a dagger in the heart of moral relativism. And I think the reason that it was that was because the Nuremberg trials established the principle that there were some acts that were wrong no matter what your culture and no matter what your orders. And that established, in some sense, not so much an absolute good, but at least an absolute evil. And there's some real utility to establishing an absolute evil, because once you accept the idea that that concept is valid, then you sketch out an absolute good in the same way that an artist sketches out negative space. Because if there is an absolute evil that you could participate in or that could take you over, then there's also its opposite. And so, to some degree, the Nuremberg trials and their consequences laid out a very stark moral choice for people. One was to justify the catastrophes of Auschwitz, let's say, by assuming that if you were enculturated in such a manner as to undertake those actions, then that was in some sense forgivable, because all moral systems are nothing but a consequence of a sociological agreement and have no fundamental metaphysical underpinnings. Or alternatively to say, no, all excuses aside, there are acts that are fundamentally wrong, and that everyone knows them in their heart of hearts. And that's a very stark choice, that choice. And it was Solzhenitsyn's conclusion that the Nuremberg judgments were correct. And it certainly struck me that from reading Solzhenitsyn and from reading people like Viktor Frankl as well, who wrote a great book called Man's Search for Meaning, that there was some ineradicable element of individual culpability at the core of what allowed totalitarian systems to flourish. And that made me think very deeply about the role of the individual. And so then I looked for other truths, I suppose, that were indisputable. Solzhenitsyn's truth derived from the Nuremberg trials was that there was that evil existed in an undeniable manner. And that's really something to come to terms with. It's a strange thing for an academic to even consider, because it's certainly been my experience in the academy that there's a cynicism about discussions of good and evil, that those are no longer categories that are appropriate ways to conceptualize the world for sophisticated people. That you look for sociological explanations, and that's mode of conceptualization is somehow an archaic hangover from our religious and superstitious past. But the problem with that is that it doesn't help us grapple with the sorts of things that happened in Auschwitz or behind the Iron Curtain in the Gulag Archipelago or in Maoist China with the millions of deaths that are clearly attributable to the pathological actions of both state and individual. And so I left that literature, which is a very dark literature, with an unshakable belief that certain actions were wrong, and also with some recognition that as a consequence, some actions were right. And whatever those actions that are right are is whatever takes you farthest away from those things that are the most dreadful. And so you could say, well, it's very difficult to determine what might constitute heaven and what might even constitute a trajectory that's heavenward. But one thing you know for sure is that it's away from hell. And that's really something to know. I thought more about the human situation. I was also curious when I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning. It was during the raging of the Cold War. I wrote most of it in the 1980s and 1990s. And I was also interested in something else that was fundamental, but it was associated with the idea of moral relativism. You know, the world had locked itself into this armed combat that ran from 1945 to 1989, but is still continuing in some sense, and of course started even before World War II, based on two different views of the world, whatever the view of the communist bloc was, and that's a collectivist view, let's say, and whatever the view that the West held, which is, you could say an individualist view, but that's not exactly accurate. We'll return to that. It's not so much individualist, I guess we'll return to it right now. It's not so much individualist as it's predicated on the idea that the fundamental conceptual level that history and humanity should be construed at has the individual at its center. And then I was curious, and I guess this was a postmodern idea, although I didn't know it at the time. I was curious about whether these were just two arbitrary systems. You know, you could imagine there's many games that people can play locally and collectively, and the relativist stance is that, well, there's a plethora of those games and there's no real way of rank ordering them morally. It's all the same in the end. And that's a reasonable claim, or at least it's a reasonable question. I don't think it's a reasonable claim, actually, but it's a reasonable question. Is there something that makes one system, in some sense, fundamentally preferable to another, fundamentally correct? Or is it a matter of arbitrary social organization as a consequence of the acceptance of some equally arbitrary initial axioms? And I think that when I was studying the Soviet Union, that I was agnostic about that. I felt that what we had accomplished in the West was admirable and worthy of protection and support, but it wasn't obvious to me if it was correct, what correct would mean or why it was correct. And so that was another problem that I was trying to solve, is this merely a matter of opinion played out in this ongoing struggle, a struggle that was intense enough to demolish many millions of people, but also for all of us to risk putting everything to the torch, because that's what we were risking during the Cold War, and what we still risk to some degree today, although I would say the danger of that has decreased at least to some degree. So if it was merely a matter of opinion, then it was certainly one that we were taking very seriously. And so then I did something intellectually that I realized later was roughly analogous to Descartes' search. He was motivated by doubt. He wanted to find something axiomatic that he could not, in which he could manifest faith that could not be shaken. And for Descartes, it was, I think, therefore I am, which I think is more something like I am conscious. I know I'm conscious, or I'm immediately aware of my own consciousness, and I can't dispute that. And I knew of Descartes' conclusion, but it wasn't the proper one for me. What I came to understand for me was that the most undeniable reality was pain. And I think that that's in keeping, and I learned that since, with the great religious traditions who insist, the Buddhists insist, for example, that life is suffering. And Judaism, of course, is rife with stories of endless historical catastrophe, and Christianity puts suffering at the middle of its conceptual system as a fundamental reality. And I believe it is a fundamental reality. And I do believe it is, in some sense, the fundamental reality. Now, it's not the only fundamental reality. And there may be truths that transcend the fact that life is suffering, but it's not a bad place to start. And I believe that it's not a bad place to start because I don't think it's deniable by anyone. First of all, even people who are morally relativistic and nihilistic have a very difficult time disputing the reality of their own pain. It's not amenable to rational eradication. You can argue yourself out of any positive meaning in life. You can say, well, what difference does it make in 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years? You can say, I'm only one person among 7 billion. What possible difference could I make? You could say, well, we all exist on a little dust speck of a planet out in the God-forsaken suburbs of an infinite universe. And all of that bespeaks of an exceptionally cold and impersonal fundamental reality. But none of that's very useful to you if you're actually suffering. And so there's an inalienable reality to pain that constitutes a meaning in life that rational discourse has no effect upon. And that's useful. And so then it struck me that there were two fundamental realities that we might all have to contend with, and one would be suffering, and the other would be malevolence of the sort that Solzhenitsyn outlined as eternal in some sense and unacceptable and manifest in such catastrophes as the Nazi Holocaust in the 30s and the 40s. Suffering and malevolence, definitional conditions of the world. And then I started to read psychology broadly, and I found people like Mircea Eliade and Carl Jung who were very interested in fundamental stories. The psychoanalysts early on started to understand that our cognitive structures are actually organized as personalities. We're collections of sub-personalities. And those personalities manifest themselves when they're represented in stories. And so we think in stories, and even more importantly, even when we don't think in stories, so let's say when we're thinking scientifically, all that articulated objective knowledge is still embedded in an underlying narrative structure. And that was a psychoanalytic claim, but when I started to study neuropsychology and brain function, the stories converged, because it also appeared to be the case that if you look at a function biologically, that the claim that we see the world as a story seems to be both objectively and metaphorically true. And that made me very interested in the structure of stories. And I started to realize, I think, that the deeper you went into a story, the closer you got to the fundamental story, and the closer you got to the fundamental story, the more you started to touch on the domain that's been eternally religious. Because I think that is what the religious domain is it's an outline of what's most fundamental about the stories that we all inhabit. I've noticed this too in my clinical practice, because I've dealt with people who've been in very, very dire straits, sometimes because tragedy has befallen them, and then more frequently because more serious, because tragedy and malevolence have befallen them. Not only has something terrible happened to them, but it was as a consequence of their own moral misstep, which is a terrible situation to be in. It's terrible to have something tragic happen to you, but it's much worse to have it happen to you because of something that you did that you didn't have to do and that you're now culpable for. That's devastating for people. Or to fall prey to the same catastrophe because of the malevolence of others. And whenever I talk to people who are in that situation, who'd been targets of their own malevolence or someone else's and have been brought low because of it, no dialogue that didn't involve religious conceptualizations came even close to dealing with the importance of the issues. And I saw that clinically, and I've also talked to many soldiers who've come to my lectures, who've watched. I have one lecture in particular on the distinction between tragedy and evil, which is a very elaborated lecture on the structure of malevolence. And many of the soldiers who talked to me who had post-traumatic stress disorder told me that they started to recover from what had happened to them once they watched that lecture. And there's a few like that, but because you need a vocabulary, a lexicon of morality. You need a lexicon of good and evil in order to deal with the fact of malevolence, whether it's yours or someone else's. And without that lexicon, then you're naive target of forces that are dark beyond your ability, not only to understand, but even to tolerate. And I mean that most seriously, because people who have post-traumatic stress disorder are actually damaged physically as a consequence. Right? It produces quite profound alterations in brain function and structure, some of which are irreversible. They're not all irreversible, but some of them are. And so that's real. So then I was curious, well, if the fundamental realities of life, the fundamental reality of life, or the undeniable substructure of life, something like that, is an intermingling of suffering and malevolence, what does that mean? Well, the suffering part, that seems to stem from the structure of existence, I suppose. We're limited creatures, finite, fragile in some sense, and we know it. And I found that outlined very interestingly in the Old Testament stories, in Genesis, especially in the story of Adam and Eve, which as far as I can tell is a condensed representation of the dawn of self-consciousness for humanity. I can tell you a bit about that quickly because I think it's so fascinating and because it took me a couple of decades to untangle. You know, Adam and Eve are portrayed in the Garden of Eden as unself-conscious, and they are forbidden to transform themselves in one particular way. They're not supposed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're warned against it, but they do because they're curious, which of course is one thing you can say about human beings, is that we're interminably curious, and that if you ever forbade us from doing anything, then that would be the first thing that we would be inclined to go and try and do. And so that's very realistic psychologically. Eve eats the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the scales fall from her eyes. That's a very interesting formulation because it means that, well, she can see now what she could not see before, which seems like an improvement, you know. You think an enhancement of vision, that's an improvement. And it is, of course, the truth that God forbids human beings to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil because they might become as gods. And so there is some strange ambivalence in that story about God's motivation in relationship to people and his desire, let's say, to keep them blind, at least to certain realities. And as soon as Eve eats and the scales fall from her eyes and she shares the fruit with Adam and the same process occurs to him, they realize that they're naked. That took me a long time to understand because I wasn't sure what it meant in that context. But to be naked, especially if you're human, is to expose yourself to the world first. I mean, we're all clothed, and we're clothed to protect ourselves from the elements, obviously, and to stay warm or to stay protected. But we're also clothed to shield ourselves from the gaze of others and to keep our private shame at our own vulnerability off the table, hidden. And that's a human universal, that proclivity to be clothed. And that realization of nakedness, I saw that occur mostly in my son when he was about somewhere between 2 and 3. You know, at one point, he just became private. He was in the bathroom alone. He didn't want people to watch him being dressed. He became very private and aware of his own nakedness. Well, when people discover their nakedness, they discover that they're going to die. That's when death enters the world. And so that's the other element of discovering your own nakedness, your own fragility, is that human beings are self-conscious in this very particular way that makes us aware of our own fragility, but also aware of our finitude, of our mortality, and that's the burden that we have as human beings that isn't shared by any other creature. And the interesting thing about the biblical metaphysic is that that's portrayed as a cataclysmic schism in the structure of reality itself. And I believe that's something that we should take very seriously because human beings are very complicated creatures. We are the most complicated things that exist by a huge margin. And we're the most complicated things that exist that have become self-conscious. And God only knows what that means for the structure of reality itself. It means nothing if you conceptualize us, as I said before, as meaningless creatures on a meaningless planet spinning around an equally meaningless sun. But if you attribute something central to the existence of consciousness itself, then a transformation in consciousness of that magnitude might well be something of cosmic significance. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at things because I think consciousness is something of cosmic significance because it seems to me that the existence of things depends in some manner that we do not understand on the conscious observer. And it's not obvious that there are any conscious observers, or at least any self-conscious observers, except us. And so, whatever that role is, it's certainly central in some important manner, if existence itself is of import. And so Adam and Eve become aware of their own fragility, and then they clothe themselves immediately. And it's partly because they're ashamed, but the reason they're ashamed is because they understand that they're vulnerable, which is the same reason that we're all ashamed. I mean, and it's certainly the case that shame is a universal human emotion. We feel that in relationship to ourselves because we're not all we could be, but we certainly feel it in relationship to others and the judgment they pass on us. And so that's an existential fact for humanity. And so to cover yourself up is to protect yourself from that, and to protect yourself as well from the fact that since you're fragile and since you're mortal, that things conspire to destroy you, not only now, perhaps when you're feeling safe, but at some point in the future where that safety disappears, because now we can consider ourselves across an expanse of time and see our vulnerability across our entire lifespan, and as a consequence, never truly be free of it, because even if you have nothing to worry about right now, which might be a situation in which an animal would not be worried, there's plenty to worry about tomorrow, and if that's fine, well, then you can always worry about next month or next year, or maybe you can worry about your family. It doesn't matter. There's plenty of vulnerability to go around. And so then that's permanent. That's a permanent descent, let's say, into a kind of existential angst. And I think that's equivalent to the entry of death into the world from a metaphysical perspective. And then the other strange thing that happens that's insisted upon in that story is that the discovery of nakedness is also simultaneously the discovery of good and evil. And that's part of the knowledge of gods, is the knowledge of good and evil. And I couldn't figure that out for the longest time. I thought, what in the world is the association between having our eyes open to our own finitude and knowledge of good and evil? And then I thought, and it took me 20 years to figure this out. I thought, oh, I understand. Once you understand your own capacity for suffering, your own vulnerability to suffering, once you understand that and can model it, once you know that you can be hurt and you know how you can be hurt, then you know how other people can be hurt. And then you can use that as a weapon. And I do believe that it is the case that human beings are the only creatures that can do that. We can use our knowledge of our own fragility as the core insight that allows us to torment ourselves and others. And that means that we're no longer innocent predators like wolves or lions that bring things down because they have to eat to live, but we've become creatures that can use agony as an aesthetic. As an aesthetic, that's the right way of putting it. And we can draw out catastrophe and suffering to as creative a degree as we can possibly manage. And that does put us instantly into a moral universe. So the idea that the individual is a moral agent, that struck me as solid in the face of suffering and malevolence. The individual is also a moral agent. And so that's one stroke on the side of the conceptual scheme that puts the individual at the center of things. And then I started to understand stories that were earlier even in the same biblical corpus. The idea that there's an idea right at the beginning of Genesis, I lectured about this a lot last year, that there are three elements that are involved in the generation of being. It's not the same idea as the construction of the material world. It's not the same frame of reference. It's a different conceptual scheme. It's one that assumes that consciousness is central to being. rather than a secondary epiphenomenon. God is a paternal figure in Genesis, a structure. God the Father is a structure. That's one way of thinking about it. And the story is that whatever this paternal structure is, patriarchal structure, let's say, uses a process, logos, to interact with chaotic potential to generate habitable order. And I think that that's an accurate way of looking at things, is that in order for there to be, there has to be a structure, there has to be a process, and there has to be something upon which that is acting. And in Genesis, that's the tohu vabohu, that's the chaotic potential. And it means without form and void, but it also means potential. And so there's this idea that God as a structure uses the logos, which is something like creative, communicative speech, something like that. It's broader than that. It also means the tendency to explore, and it also means truth. It means all of those things at once. To interact with potential and to generate habitable order. And then there's an insistence in the same story that when that process occurs properly, which means that it's created by the logos, then the habitable order that is created is good. One of the things I learned from Solzhenitsyn and also from Viktor Frankl and other observers, Jung as well, Carl Jung believed that psychotherapy was unnecessary if it could be substituted, if a sufficient moral effort could be substituted. So he thought of psychotherapy as a fundamentally moral process and really believed that it was a consequence of truth. And I would say that's true of all the clinical psychologists and psychiatrists that I've studied. In the final analysis, their fundamental claim is that something like a combination of courage and truth is redemptive. It's very interesting because it's a restatement of a very old idea. It's the oldest idea in the West, perhaps, that courage and truth are redemptive. Certainly, if you're in Freudian psychoanalysis, you go into your past and what you haven't yet been able to process because perhaps you've avoided it, that might be repression. I think it's not a bad example of repression, although sometimes you avoid because you cannot understand, and sometimes you avoid because you will not understand. But the confrontation with what you found intolerable in the past is curative. And then that's generalized across the psychotherapeutic disciplines, because in every psychotherapeutic school, there are certain truths that are intolerable in some sense that you're encouraged to voluntarily confront and to analyze, and then to articulate, and then to accept, and then to adapt to. And so there's definitely a call to courageous, truthful being in the psychotherapeutic process that looks to me like a recapitulation of a much older religious idea. And so that's another good example of the truth that people act as fundamental moral agents. Then there's a more prosaic element, and you can think about this. I think it's worth thinking about, because I think this is how we think of each other. And I think this is how we treat each other. And I think this is what we upbraid ourselves for when we fail. You wake up in the morning, and what is it that confronts you? Now, you could say that it's the material reality of the circumstances around you, and that you're driven like clockwork by that. But that isn't how it appears phenomenologically, I don't believe. I don't see that that's how we see ourselves when we awaken in the morning. What we see in front of us is a field of potential, constrained to a large degree for some of us and wider for others, but still definitely present. And that's the domain of what could be that day. And I think the day is the right level of analysis. And you wake up and you confront the world and you think, well, here's a variety of ways that things could play themselves out today. And that's that field of potential that's in front of you. It could go this way, or it could go this way, or it could go that way. And you know that maybe you have difficult decisions ahead of you, and you know that perhaps you're motivated to avoid some of them, or maybe not to take the difficult decision, but to take the easy way out. And you have some inkling of how things would go if you did it properly, or if you avoided it, or if you took the easy way out. You can understand how the future would be likely to unfold if you took any of those patterns of action. And then you get up and you decide to act or to not act in accordance with your decisions. And as a consequence, you turn the potential that characterizes the future into the actuality of the present and the past. And so to me, what that means is that whatever your consciousness is, which in the oldest sense is the thing that has, what would you say? It's that which dwells within you, that's made in the image of the God who created things at the beginning of time. That's the idea, is that the implementation of that transforms the chaotic potential that confronts you in the form of the indeterminate future into the actual world. And that's what we do. And we do that as a consequence of our moral choices. And in Genesis, the claim is that insofar as God used the Logos to perform exactly the same function, then the habitable order that was created was good. And that's insisted upon repeatedly. And so there's a deep ethic there, and it's a very deep ethical idea. And the idea is that it's possible, you have within your grasp the possibility to take the world despite its suffering and its malevolence and to confront it in a manner that, as a consequence of applying truth, will transform what you produce out of that potential into what is good. And that's a call for a particular form of ethical being. And it's on you. Is that you make decisions to go this way or that way, and some of the decisions lead up to something that's positive, and some of the decisions lead down to something that's negative. And if enough of us make the decision to move down into what's negative, then that's exactly what happens. And we create situations around us that are so close to hell that the distinction is merely semantic. And so you might say, well, you're no believer in heaven, and perhaps you're no believer in God, but you could easily be a believer in the ability of your own cowardly indecision and determination to use deceit instead of confronting things courageously and truthfully to produce something around you that's hell for all intents and purposes. And I think that was the lesson of the 20th century. I think that's exactly what happened. I think that the reason it happened is because individuals abandoned their moral responsibility. And that moral responsibility is, in some sense, absolute enough to be unbearable. Having said that, so then my conclusion, because of all that, and for other reasons as well, was that, well, it was true that life is suffering tainted by malevolence, but that there was a power of spirit that characterized the human being that enabled him or her to confront that forthrightly with nobility of purpose and to transcend the suffering and constrain the malevolence, and that was within our grasp. And that what that meant fundamentally was that despite the undeniable structural reality of finitude and evil, that the spirit of the human being was so powerful in its potential that could be confronted and accepted as a fundamental responsibility, and then transcended and repaired as a consequence. And so that was an inversion of the most pessimistic possible view I suppose, which is that life is ineradicably suffering and malevolence, into the opposite view, which is that if that is taken on voluntarily, then it's something that can be transcended and rectified. And that's the sacred responsibility of every single person. And worse, that the abdication of that responsibility, which is in some sense virtually unbearable in its weight, that the abandonment of that or the avoidance of it produces a void in the structure of reality that's filled by something that's hellish. And so it's not only that you fail to make things better when you could by stopping doing the things that you know to be wrong, but that if you don't take forthright action, then the space you leave is filled by something that's dreadful. And so the conclusion of all that was that the collectivists were wrong, and those who insisted that the individual was the sovereign foundation of the state, and that each individual has a divine element that's the rationale for that foundational sovereignty and the reason for our equality before God and the law, that's correct in the most fundamental of ways. And that it wasn't a mere matter of arbitrary argumentation and moral relativism, but a battle between a viewpoint that was fundamentally correct and functional, although overwhelming, and one that was destined to pathological catastrophe right from the onset. And so what I've been attempting to do since then, and I guess that's part of the reason why you're all here, I suppose, is to suggest to individuals that there's far more to you than you would like to believe. And that whether you manifest that in the world properly makes far more difference than you would like to imagine. And the downside of that is the crushing weight of that voluntary adoption of your moral burden. But the upside is the discovery of the nobility that's within you, that's of sufficient force and power to be aligned in some sense with the most fundamental realities of the world, and that constitutes a sufficient wellspring of strength, if drawn upon properly, for you to bear the suffering and malevolence that characterizes the world without becoming corrupted as a consequence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson.